Dr. Amy Bix, she received her PhD in 1994 from Johns Hopkins in the Department of History of Science, Medicine, and Technology. Since 1993, she's been a member of the History Department here at Iowa State, teaching courses in general American history, in women's history, and history of science, technology, and medicine. She's published a variety of articles, including pieces on history of women as eugenics research workers and on the history of funding for breast cancer and AIDS. Her book, which is entitled Inventing Ourselves Out of Jobs, Americans Debate Over Technological Unemployment, 1929 to 1981, was published by Johns Hopkins University in 2000, and there are copies over there for sale. Her current research project focuses on the history of engineering education for American women, tracing how, when, and why institutions such as Iowa State, MIT, RPI, Cornell, and Caltech, as well as other universities, began admitting women to engineering programs. The study touches on questions about the gendered nature of technical knowledge and about the boundaries of professionalization. And she has a few articles, including one one's titled Feminism Where Men Predominate, The History of Women's Science and Engineering Education at MIT, and another one that has an even more interesting title, in my opinion, Engineeresses Invade Campus, 4 Decades of Debate Over Technical Co-Education. So today she's going to share with us some stories and images from ISU's archives. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Bix. She'll be giving a talk entitled Women in the History of Iowa State University.
Great. Okay. Thank you for coming out, everyone. Well, I must say that as a historian, I'm absolutely thrilled to be at Iowa State at this time when we have the opportunity to celebrate our sesquicentennial. I hope some of you have seen the fabulous book that was published with terrific photos from Iowa State's archives, Special Collections Department. And there are so many things that we can talk about with the centennial. Student life, we can talk about athletics, we can talk about the campus, we can talk about the many great leaders that Iowa State has had. But one of the things that I love talking about most, of course, is the history of women at Iowa State. And the nice thing about this being a sort of afternoon talk as opposed to part of a class is that I don't have to feel obliged to cover the whole sweep of everything to do with women at the history of Iowa State for 150 years. Instead, I have the freedom, at least I hope I have the freedom, to focus on the parts of the history that I love best and that I hope will catch your attention too. So, women in the history of Iowa State. By the way, is this okay? Can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, in order to understand the history of women at Iowa State College, as it was first called, of course, you've got to understand the context of the history of women's education here in the United States during that time period, because it's not something that you can take for granted. If you look at colonial or revolutionary America, education for women is spotty. It gets more attention in places like New England, which puts a premium on established education to begin with, but then in other areas like the Western frontier or the South, it's a bit more spotty. It's also, of course, very heavily gender divided. Education for boys in early America is provided often by what they call seminaries. And one of the main purposes of seminary education is to prepare boys to enter the ministry, also to become lawyers, to become politicians, and along those lines, they concentrate on, among other things, classical education, Greek and Latin, and the classical literature. But of course, women can't become ministers, women can't become lawyers, women can't become politicians, much less even vote. So why give them that type of education? And there is pretty much an assumption that, aside from a few extraordinary women, like Queen Elizabeth I of England, most women's brains aren't cut out to handle Greek and Latin, the demanding classical curriculum anyway. So there are a number of schools for girls in early America, but by and large, those are seen as preparing girls for one career and one career only, teaching and motherhood. Becoming a school teacher was one of the few job options that was open to women in early America through a good part of the 1800s. It was something respectable that women could do. It was seen as an extension of their natural motherhood role, and it paid relatively well for a woman. School districts liked hiring women as teachers because they could get away with paying them half the rate that they had to pay male teachers. And then, of course, educating girls was also seen as preparing them to become mothers themselves, giving them a foundation in reading and arithmetic and geography that they could use to train their sons to grow up to be good citizens and their daughters to be good future mothers of citizens of the Republic. There are public high schools, but similarly for girls. Their main purpose is to turn out what one observer called fit wives for educated men. So that's the context for very early education for women in this country until you get to 1833, the first, what we can really call college to admit women, Oberlin. You've had other colleges in the United States before, but of course, William and Mary, Harvard go back several centuries before. But Oberlin is different. Among other things, Oberlin is founded on evangelical principles. It's a very religious school, and because of that, one of its purposes was to instill students with a very definite ethic of religious morality and social reform. And because of that, they're interested in educating women students as future reformers, as mothers, as teachers, but ones who are also going to go out and transform this country, either on a small basis in their families or a bigger basis. For the same reason, they're interested in educating African American students, one of the few colleges for decades that will even consider admitting blacks, so that the African Americans can do what they then called uplift the race. Oberlin doesn't actually get around to issuing its first women's degrees until 1842, but you can see here's a picture of the female graduates of Oberlin in 1855, and even though they turn out just a handful of women, some of those women are incredibly influential. Some of the most famous alumni include Lucy Stone, who was a very active proponent of the women's rights movement in the 1800s, and Antoinette Brown Blackwell, who was the first female ordained minister of a recognized American denomination. So in many ways, you can say the history of higher education for women gets started at Oberlin. But the nice fact is, Iowa State isn't that far behind. Right from the beginning, pretty much, Iowa State is considering opening admission to women as well as men. There is some opposition from trustees, particularly in more conservative parts of Iowa. They have their reservations, but the vote in the end goes in favor of making Iowa State coeducational with a very definite perspective. Take a look at this comment. If young men are to be educated to fit them for successful, intelligent, and practical farmers and mechanics, is it not as essential that young women should be educated in a manner that will properly qualify them to properly understand and discharge their duties as wives of farmers and mechanics? Because remember, Iowa State is founded specifically as a land-grant institution. That means a number of things, a very different type of education, and one that's meant to be more applicable to the needs of Iowa as a state. Publicly funded education, meant to develop the economic basis of Iowa, the infrastructure to encourage people to settle here, to support economic growth and social progress. So they're looking at training young men as educated scientific farmers. You're not going to give them so much of the abstract Greek and Latin to train them to become ministers. Instead, you focus on things like agriculture on an intelligent, educated basis, but with a very definite end in mind. And this comes through when they talk about teaching women. We must teach the girls through our agricultural college to acquire by practice a thorough knowledge of the art of conducting a well-regulated household, practiced in our farmhouse, boarding hall, garden, dairy, and kitchen. So, it's not as if Iowa State is established to train women to become presidents or CEOs or business leaders or major thinkers of any type, they don't have that in mind. Instead, they want to give women a college education to prepare them to be good female Iowa citizens, to raise future Iowa citizens, in particular, ones who are able to conduct a well-regulated household, a household that's efficient, that doesn't waste things, that makes good use of its resources, and that contributes substantially to the economy and the society of the state. Now, you've got to keep this in perspective. On the one hand, to us, sometimes this seems like a very limited view of women's education. But at the time, simply admitting women to college was, in its way, still a very, very controversial step in the 1850s and the 1860s. There's a lot of talk during that period by critics of this whole idea of women's education that admitting women to college runs the risk of unsexing them. And that's the word they use. And there is, in fact, some talk about women literally being unsexed by education. Their breasts shrinking, their bodies developing along more manly lines. And they're worried even more than that about what it would do to women's character. One of the founders of Vassar, the women's school, said that Vassar had been founded with a particular aim in mind to keep their students feminine. They were worried lest by too close an imitation of students of ordinary colleges, i.e. men's colleges, they're worried we should impair womanliness in our students and encourage the formation of those mannish tastes and manners which are so disgusting to every right mind. So, God forbid they should send women to college and have them develop a man-like mind, a man-like character, because in a woman, that type of mind is disgusting. So there's real hesitation over whether it's a good idea for women to go to college at all. And there's one story, maybe apocryphal, but I'm ready to believe it, about one very well-respected family, which actually told people that their daughter was dead, rather than admit that she'd done something as unusual as go to college. Because there is this concern. What if the same forces that develop all that is most manly in one sex repress and dwarf that is all that is most womanly in the other? And that concern's only exacerbated when you have debates going on over the even more fundamental question of what clothes women are supposed to wear. You remember Amelia Bloomer, the dress reformer, who's trying to get women out of the long, heavy skirts and the petticoats and the corsets and promote the idea of women wearing pants. Now, I always tell students, you look at this and it's not like they're being exhibitionistic. It's not like they're revealing a lot of flesh, just the contrary. But they are very obviously wearing pants. And that in itself opens these women up for an enormous firestorm of criticism. And the same thing with education. Women who are venturing into what's seen as men's territory become the whole focus of a lot of concern and criticism from no less than such celebrated figures as a Harvard doctor by the name of Edward Clark. In 1873, he writes a book called Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. And in this book, he doesn't actually come out and oppose the whole idea of women going to college. That's a mistake that students often make. He says it's all right for women who are interested, who have a good mind. It's all right for them to go to college, but their college has to be very different from the type of college meant for boys. He says, for fundamental biological reasons, girls' education must be different than that of boys. And that fundamental reason comes down to what happens to women once a month. You've got to understand, in the 1800s, Clark, like a number of other doctors, viewed the human body as an economic system that had limited resources. And the concern was that resources that went to one part of the body, by definition, wouldn't be available for the rest of it. And Clark's assumption, along with a number of other observers, was that for women, their reproductive systems ought to have first claim on their biological resources, particularly at menstruation, which was seen as a stressful and demanding time on women's bodies. Women weren't supposed to really be doing much of anything. They were supposed supposed to really rest and relax. Now, obviously, this is a very class-based notion. I mean, everybody's got female cooks and female laundresses and female servants, and they're not telling them once a month, oh, you don't need to work this week, go up to your room and put your feet up. But for upper middle class and upper class women, they're supposed to cultivate their bodies, take care of them, particularly in the delicate stage of adolescence. And so there's a fear that if girls go to college and try to study just as hard as boys do, if they study long hours, if they study the same subjects with the same intensity, the fear is, Clark warns, that's going to be biologically disastrous. It will destroy them as women. The doctors warn, a woman may be highly cultured and accomplished, but her future husband will discover too late that he's married a large outfit of headaches and backaches instead of a woman fitted to take up the duties of life. So Edward Clark, summoning all his authority as a noted Boston doctor, fills this book with all sorts of anecdotes about how he's seen numerous women go to college and try to study as hard as the boys do, only to collapse after a few months, utterly exhausted. Or he says maybe they make it all the way through college by some miracle, but then they get out and they find they've permanently damaged their reproductive systems. They can't have children, which of course is one of the worst possible things that can happen to a wife and a husband in that day. So Clark gives all sorts of testimony. Again, the emphasis, girls need to take care of themselves, especially during menstruation. We cannot too emphatically urge the importance of regarding these monthly returns, that Victorian euphemism, as periods of ill health. By definition, a woman menstruating is in ill health when ordinary occupations are to be suspended or modified. Long walks, dancing, shopping, riding, and parties should be avoided at this time of month under all circumstances. And as for studying, if you don't avoid studying at that time of month, Clark gives case studies. For example, this woman, Miss G, he uses that sort of abbreviation for names. She worked her way through New England high schools to a Western college, which she entered with credit to herself, and from which she graduated, leading male and female students alike. She worked continuously and perseveringly through the years of her first critical epoch, again, nice Victorian euphemism, through the onset of menstruation, without any regard to the periodical type of her organization. In other words, she keeps studying during that one crucial week a month. After graduation, she began to show signs of failure, and some years later, he doesn't tell us how many years later, she died. A post-mortem exam disclosed in the brain commencing degeneration. She was unable to make a good brain that could stand the wear and tear of life, and also a good reproductive system that should serve the race. There's some eugenic-flavored words there. At the same time that she was continuously spending her force in intellectual labor. Nature asked for a periodical remission and did not get it. So, Clark's stories, to us, they seem ridiculous. They seem overblown. Undergraduates always go into fits of laughter when I talk about this concern that girls might be permanently damaging their health by studying too hard. But it is a very serious concern in the 1800s. And because of that, women's colleges and places like Iowa State that admitted women students explicitly paid a lot of attention to women's health. They taught women how to eat a good, nutritious diet. They really forced them onto a good sleep schedule, and they put a lot of emphasis on women's sports, particularly sports that were seen as appropriate for women, things that you could play while still wearing decent skirts, like golf and ice skating, and even bicycling. Those were seen as good for nice, graceful women. Competitive sports, like basketball, were a bit more tricky because they didn't want the women getting too assertive, too aggressive, too competitive, because that would make them too much man-like. So that's one reason why you see the evolution, for instance, of special rules for girls' basketball that do things like limit the number of times they're allowed to bounce the basketball before they have to pass, that type of thing. So they encourage women's health as basically trying to defend the validity of women's education against critics like Clark. So it's within this context that Iowa State approaches the question of admitting women. Iowa State's first president, Adonijah Welch, to his credit, makes some very interesting statements. Among other things, he says, woman undoubtedly has comparative intellectual strength to men. Not everyone would have agreed with that. He goes on to ask, has society ever given to women the advantages to encourage learning and original discovery? So fighting the argument that, well, women have never been great scholars, women have never been great leaders, raising the question, have we given them the opportunity? Welch goes on to say, we need not heed the suggestion that enlarged intelligence will divert woman's attention from domestic life. Beyond question, these are the employments to which her sympathies naturally and usually point. Among her increased facilities for scientific instruction should stand prominent the study of domestic economy. So take a look. He's saying we don't have to worry that by admitting women to Iowa State College, we're going to eliminate all future Iowa housewives, because he says by their nature, women are always going to want to be wives and mothers, and so we'll have them study domestic economy on a scientific basis and make them better wives and mothers. Whoops. So, 1871, the trustees decide to adopt formally what they call a ladies' course of study, and they can find no better person than the wife of the president himself, Mary Welch. They ask Mary Welch to deliver to junior women a course of lectures on domestic economy. So Mary Welch is faced with the question. She's basically got to create this department from scratch, this whole school of study. What's going to be involved? She herself has to learn. She goes to New York City to study at the School of Cooking there, and she actually goes all the way over to England to take some classes about the nature of food and the biology of digestion. And from this, she develops this outlook and these lessons, emphasizing homemaking as a profession, one that will benefit women's individual families, but by extension benefit the entire country. So the classes that end up getting developed by Mary Welch and by others here at Iowa State and others at schools across the country, there are classes in cooking. And it's not fancy Julia Child French chef type of cooking. Instead, they're teaching girls to cook things that are seen as appropriate for future Iowa housewives, plain cooking, nice solid meats, nice simple vegetables, and simple desserts, not fancy, gorgeous layer cakes, but something that the men and boys will be glad to eat when they come in from the field. And how do the students learn this? Well, they practice. They prepared dishes in their classes, and then those dishes were served in the college dining halls for lunch or dinner. I kind of throw in this quote just because I like it. Emma Ewing, one of the early Iowa State home economists, what this country needs is better pumpkin pies and less politics. I must say, last time I gave this talk, we were sort of in the middle of leading up to the Iowa caucuses. And when I put that up there was kind of this cheer through the room because people were fed up with the caucuses. But more than that, Iowa State and other places that develop the field that's going to come to be known as home economics emphasize that it is a serious academic course of study. To take one example, many recipes of the day, you've seen these, they're decidedly loose. These are the recipes that talk about add a pinch of salt, add a smidgen of this, use your own judgment about seasoning. Mary Welch, among many others, says that's no good intellectually. She says to be good for anything, a recipe should be as definite as a mathematical statement. The same quantities of material put together should always produce the same results. Guessing is of no more value in cooking than in science. So women in the home economics departments systematically learned cooking. They learned to experiment. What happens if you use baking soda rather than baking powder in a recipe? What happens if you change the proportions? Does it work or does it not? It's not just cooking either. A good course in domestic economy should include things like washing and ironing, vital parts of the household. And again, students learn through practice. Each woman student not only did her own laundry, she actually practiced ironing one man's shirt each week. And they use exactly the same language that they use in the science classes. Their laundry classroom is referred to as the scrub laboratory. So they have all these courses set up meant to put domestic economy for women on a scientific basis. They recognize, among other things, that the equipment that women use in housework varies drastically depending on individual circumstances. Iowa State, perhaps because of its link to engineering, had a particular specialty in the study of what was called household equipment, the study of stoves, of ice boxes, and later refrigerators. There were some courses where women would literally take apart a refrigerator and put it back together so they could learn how it worked. And the girls practiced working in all sorts of kitchens. Iowa State had different types of setups. There was one classroom set up like your typical farm kitchen, equipment maybe a bit more old-fashioned, maybe more spread out. Then there was another classroom set up as an urban kitchen, very, very small, very close together. A modern kitchen, if you were lucky enough to marry a rich man who could buy you all the latest appliances, things like a garbage disposal, you would be all set to use one after taking this course. And then, of course, Iowa State's home management houses, the houses that were set up around campus where women could actually practice day-to-day living. They would move in for a semester, and as some historians of Iowa State have noted, they even practiced being mothers. They borrowed babies, orphans, kids out for fostering from Des Moines, and these kids would live in the home management house with a dozen women students, and the babies were just spoiled rotten by all accounts. But it was a way for the women to learn homemaking. But again, the emphasis is always science. There were special science courses set up for the women at Iowa State, courses emphasizing things like the chemistry of household life, the chemistry involved in the preservation of meat, how food chemically changes as you cook it, and the requirements are really pretty substantial. The women at Iowa State are taking chemistry, they're taking physics, they're taking math as part of their curriculum. And this quote gives you an emphasis on that. Instead of merely empirical work, learning to make good bread, which any mother ought to be able to teach her daughter, students approach it in a scientific manner and come out as well equipped as the trained agriculturalist or engineer. Now, it's worth emphasizing that there's more, much more to Iowa State's home economics program as it develops over the decades than just undergraduate teaching. As you know from the very beginning, extension was a major part of Iowa State's mission, in particular once you get the extension service law. There are some fabulous stories about this. Among other things, there were literally trains that ran all over the state as part of the extension service. And sometimes they had one train car that was set up with special kitchen equipment, and the home economists on that trip would give cooking demonstrations to the women who would come out in Ottumwa or Oskaloosa, Tama, Iowa, give cooking demonstrations. And then, of course, women could also come to Ames, to the campus itself, for week-long short courses on special topics. And still another part of extension, of course, the Iowa State Fair. Alongside the engineering departments, the home economists have exhibits at the State Fair. The goal, as they said, was to reach the last woman on the last farm. And that goal continues in the 1920s and the 1930s, 1940s. Once radio gets going, WOI, there's a program called the Homemakers Half Hour, where you have women connected with Iowa State giving topics on how to cook your Thanksgiving turkey or how to put good art in your home, art appreciation, literature appreciation, all sorts of programs. Not only that, of course, Iowa State keeps developing the intellectual side of home economics. To the graduate level, we start issuing master's degree in home economics, and more we're preparing women not just as housewives, but for careers, to become home economics teachers themselves, or to go to work for food companies like General Foods or Kellogg's. No coincidence that the Rice Krispie treat is invented by an Iowa State graduate. We train people in home economics journalism. A number of Iowa State graduates get jobs writing food columns and household columns for magazines like Ladies' Home Companion and newspapers like the Des Moines Register. The size of the department only keeps increasing until by the 1950s you're up over 100 staff members, 20 of them with doctoral degrees. So that's the history of home economics and women at Iowa State. But for the last few minutes of my talk, as I said, I'm going to indulge myself and talk about the things that I love best. I'm going to talk about a very different part of the history of women at Iowa State, women and engineering. And for this, we need to jump a bit chronologically. Take your mind up to World War II. Most people are familiar with Rosie the Riveter, right? These gorgeous images, and you know how that came about. World War II, the men are getting drafted, the men are volunteering for military service, and that means the companies that are trying to turn out planes and tanks and guns and ammunition, they're under pressure to produce faster more than ever. They're supposed to run round-the-clock shifts, but they don't have enough men. So companies that in normal times never would have hired a woman, all of a sudden they're looking to hire women, Rosie the Riveter. Most people are a bit familiar with that history, but what a lot of people don't realize is that those same companies are facing shortages not only of assembly line workers, but also engineers. They need engineers to keep designing and refining the designs of the new airplanes, to keep production rolling, to make it more efficient. And this is a real problem for companies like the Curtiss-Wright Airplane Company that was turning out planes that were a mainstay of our military, but they were under a severe manpower shortage. So Curtiss-Wright comes up with a very interesting idea. They realize they can't hire dozens of women engineers because there aren't dozens of women in the country who hold engineering degrees. But if they don't exist already, how about creating them? They come up with the idea, which is partially borrowed from an idea with the federal government, of emergency wartime training courses. You don't prepare full engineers, but instead you give someone a very focused 6-month, 8-month training course focused on what they need to know so that they can go into the defense industry and make a useful contribution to the war effort. So you see these ads appearing in college newspapers all over the country. Look how they phrase it. Woman attending college, an opportunity to participate in the war effort by enrolling as a Curtiss Engineering Cadet. That was a new program that the Curtiss-Wright Airplane Company created, a cadet program where they would try to give several hundred women a crash course in engineering so that the women could come help out Curtiss-Wright in its defense production. In order to implement this program, Curtiss-Wright reached an agreement with 7 schools: Cornell, Penn State, Purdue, Minnesota, Texas, Rensselaer Polytechnic, and our very own Iowa State. The idea was to train about 750 women divided between these schools to give them a crash course in aeronautical engineering. And you can see here, here's the outline of the program. Take a look, it's actually quite substantial. Look, they're learning engineering math, they're learning aircraft drawing, they're learning aircraft materials, they're learning theory of flight. A lot of these courses, they're using exactly the same textbooks as the men would have used. The standards are very, very high because the fate of the country is literally at stake. So it's a very intense 6-month program. And you can see here, this is just an outline of some of the things they learned in their materials testing course. They're getting the full gamut, from tension testing, compression testing, down to shear testing, and wind tunnel work. So it's a very substantive crash course. This makes a big splash at Iowa State. I mean, we're talking front page headline, full page type. College will train co-eds for work in plane engineering. Now, something to keep in mind. Iowa State has been coeducational for basically more than 80 years at this point. Having women on campus is nothing new. But having women study engineering specifically, that's something radically new. In earlier decades, when you'd had maybe the occasional woman here or there who'd been interested in studying engineering, most of them had been discouraged. There was one case, a young woman who'd grown up on a farm. She'd grown up with farm equipment, working on her her dad's automobile. She came here and wanted to study agricultural engineering. Probably with the best intentions in the world, the dean of the engineering school then discouraged her. You'd be the only woman. It would be awkward. It would be uncomfortable. It would be inappropriate. And he sent her over to the household equipment part of the home economics school. But here, because of the war effort, women studying engineering suddenly becomes a much more acceptable, even welcomed concept. That doesn't mean that people take it for granted. This is an article from Purdue, which was one of the other states that had a Curtis Wright program. Take a look at the headline, Cadets Invade Campus. That word invade is used over and over again when talking about really a relative handful of women entering engineering. It shows you how they're perceived as the other, as different. But they also make great news. As you can see, this is the cover photo from the Penn State Alumni Magazine during World War II. They gather all the Curtis Wright cadets on the airfield and have them pose there, because if nothing else, this is a great story about the way that Penn State and the other campuses are contributing to the war effort. Now, Iowa State, Purdue, Minnesota, Cornell, they already had women on campus. Granted, the women were usually studying home economics rather than engineering, but at least people were used to seeing women on campus. It's an entirely different story at Rensselaer Polytechnic. There you get even bigger headlines. Institute breaks 116-year-old rule due to war need. The war today wiped away another tradition of more than a century standing. For really the first time, women are going to be admitted to RPI. At first, a number of RPI people are concerned. This seems to be violating RPI's best traditions as a male engineering school, but pretty soon they find advantages. Among other things, they find that women make great assets for the cheerleading squad. So this is the Curtis Wright program, and even if there's some residual criticism of women in engineering, the women in the Curtis Wright program can defend what they're doing, among other things, on patriotic ground. Take a look at this ad from Purdue. It shows one of the Curtis Wright cadets literally walking arm in arm with Uncle Sam, with the blueprints and the slide rule under her arm. She's very definitely an engineer. She's also very definitely a woman wearing this nice demure skirt and heels, and she's very definitely doing her part for the war effort. Similarly, take a look at this drawing that one of the cadets herself made, where she's literally wrapping herself in the flag. So the cadets admit that what they're doing, studying engineering, traditionally the most macho of all male fields, is unusual, but they're justifying it. They're saying so much of the United States, so much of our normal way of life has been temporarily suspended. This is just another part of the war effort. They also portray themselves as real professionals, about to go to work for Curtis Wright. One nice part of the Curtis Wright program is that all of a sudden you get photographs flooding not just local newspapers, but even national media of women studying engineering. Here you've got one photograph of a woman learning welding techniques. Here you've got another photograph of a woman studying wind science. So all these are appearing in national papers. This photo was actually in Life magazine. It did a whole feature on the cadets. They were beautifully photogenic. So the cadets can justify their existence in that way. At places like Iowa State, observers have to come to terms with this change. The Iowa Engineer editorializes, men were on guard for the preservation of the good name of Iowa State's engineering school when Curtis Wright brought a group of girls here to study aeronautical engineering. Girls in the wind tunnel, girls in the shop, caused the engineers to wonder, then acknowledge, and finally resign themselves to the fact that there would be similar incursions, notice that word, as long as the war continues, and perhaps even after the war. Now, something very interesting. It's hard to say that the Curtis Wright program was a great success. A limited success maybe, but not a great success. You've got to keep in mind, most of the women recruited for the Curtiss-Wright program never had any intention originally of being engineers anyway. Most of them had been planning to become teachers or maybe doctors. They'd had some science and math, but they hadn't been looking at engineering. Among other things, one of the sad parts is that Curtiss-Wright didn't really plan well. They had 6 months to prepare. They should have been ready. But when the first set of cadets graduates from their crash course, sometimes Curtiss-Wright doesn't quite know what to do with them. It puts them to make work jobs, and some of the women get a bit discouraged by that. Wartime is also chaotic. People move around a lot. A woman might go to work at the Curtiss-Wright plant in St. Louis, and then her husband might be transferred to a base in Texas, so she'd have to leave her job. So at the end of the Curtiss-Wright program, most of the women basically said, I was glad to do my part for the war effort, but originally I wanted to be a teacher, not an engineer. I think I'll go back now and finish my education to become a teacher. A few of them did continue in engineering, but it's not like this program created 700 new woman engineers. But one very substantial thing it did do, it did shed a positive publicity light on the whole idea of women studying engineering, and that in itself during the war years starts to attract more women to engineering as a regular degree program at Iowa State and a number of other schools. So at Iowa State during the war, you see more and more women studying engineering, still just a handful, still just a dozen, still 20, but many more than you had before the war, and making a name for themselves. 1944, a woman invaded, notice the word, the Guard of St. Patrick for the first time. Ruth Best is initiated along with 33 men. Several months later, Eloise Heckert becomes the first Iowa State woman initiated into Pi Tau Sigma, the honorary mechanical engineering fraternity. 1945, Mary Kremholtz becomes the first woman to edit the Iowa Engineer magazine, and she immediately writes an editorial, "Slide rule-pushing girls are no longer a rarity. We see them on our own campus, and they are not the problem they were once expected to be. In fact, they are a problem only in as much as their fellow students and instructors choose to make them one." Obviously, there's a long struggle ahead for any woman who presumes to enter a man's field. Men cannot be expected to share the profession voluntarily, and in the dim, distant future when the break does come and women are accepted rather than tolerated, the concession will be made only as a matter of necessity. Fairly pessimistic. Meanwhile, we shall continue with our present compromise. Compromise was a good word for it, actually. After the war, you get a continuing debate about whether women really have a place in engineering. On the one hand, you get into the Cold War. The United States is desperate for engineers and scientists to keep ahead of the Soviet Union. Some observers are saying we should train more women as engineers, our untapped source of engineering talent. But at the same time, you also get articles like this one, saying women are not for engineering. And that article isn't written by just a random guy off the street. It's actually written by Eric Walker, Dean of Engineering at Penn State University. And he says explicitly, except for a few unusual women such as Lillian Gilbreth, women simply don't have the talent for engineering. Companies can waste $10,000 hiring a beautiful blonde engineer only to see her quit after a few years and go off to raise a family. So it's an ongoing debate, but ultimately you do see more support for women, not just nationally, but on campuses, with things like the formation of the Society of Women Engineers. Here you've got a photo of Iowa State, some of their own SWE women, and colleges like Iowa State, particularly by the time you get to the 1970s, begin actively recruiting women to enter engineering. Here you see one of our recruiting and brochures, Women in Engineering. You bet, you bet, you bet. Today, our women in engineering here at Iowa State completely take for granted that they have a right to study engineering as much as any other field. And that's the way it should be, but understanding how we got there is a very important part of the history of women at Iowa State. And that's what I love about the history of women at Iowa State. So, we've got a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much. I haven't actually, the question was how many Curtiss Wright people go on to become official engineers. I haven't done a count. I need to sit down and do that one of these days. The records aren't complete. Unfortunately, as you probably know, some of the Curtiss Wright archives have been lost. There is sort of a partial survey of the Minnesota cadets, the ones who were trained at the University of Minnesota. And that suggests that maybe out of about 100 cadets, maybe only about 3 or 4 or 5 of them continued in engineering. And I would guess that's probably typical of the whole program. Yeah.
What percentage of the engineering students today here at Iowa State are women? Do you know that?
Oh boy, I should have that figure.
15%.
15, 1.5. 1.5, yeah.
But the interesting thing is, do you know what the percentage in veterinary medicine is of women?
About 75.
Right, isn't that? And I was also thinking about dentistry and medicine. I think those are extremely high too, aren't they? Over 50.
Yeah. Of course, one of the sad parts is that as you see more and more women going into vet med, the average starting salaries in that field have gone down. And it's actually been something of a debate within the veterinary field today, as I understand it, not actively opposing women, but basically talking about this as how the field is changing, in part from big animals to small animal practice, and it all becomes one of a piece. But it is very interesting to talk about what's happened with women in engineering. A number of observers are concerned that we really have plateaued, and sometimes we actually go backwards, not just at Iowa State, but nationwide. The women in engineering, it really overall doesn't come anywhere close to 50%. And you've got programs now to encourage girls in engineering and sciences, the stuff we do here at Iowa State, similar programs around the country to bring elementary school girls to campus for a week or even a weekend to give them classes where they can play with robotics. Girl Scouts has completely changed. I mean, when I was a Girl Scout, you got badges in cooking and environmental stuff, but now they've got badges in computers. So there are all these programs, and yet there's a concern that somehow there's a sort of hump that we can't get over. But that's a question, that's a huge question, and basically that's what our advanced program here at Iowa State is talking about. A number of people are approaching this bigger question of women in science and engineering from the whole perspective of economics, sociology, psychology. I'm approaching it mostly from the historical side.
It's interesting you comment about the women going into veterinary medicine and the decline of income. On the other hand, we have a high percentage going into dentistry, and I see dentistry is now supposedly, although I question this, has a higher average income than physicians. So, in other words, the dentists, all the women that are going into dentistry, I think the average salary I saw a couple of years ago was $150,000 to $200,000, which is a decent income today.
Yeah. And it definitely affects women's career choices. I mean, a number of years, just a few years ago, computer engineering was a very, very hot field for men and to a lesser extent for women. But with the Silicon Valley crash, some of that excitement burned off, and you really saw a sharp plunge in some places in the number of women going into computer engineering. So these trends go up and down, and it's not, one big overall pattern. Dentistry is a unique profession with its own pressures. The history of women in medicine this last year was the first time that the number of women's applications to medical school actually was higher than the number of men's applications. The number of women admitted to medical school was still just a little bit lower than the number of men, but that trend in applications, the women actually passed the men. So there's some interesting things happening.
Amy, my question is about who taught initially these women in the home economics department. Were they women who were experienced, their children had moved on, owned their own farms, went to school, whatever? But I mean, somebody had to teach these incoming women, so were they just hired on the basis of their experience as a good Iowa housewife, or what is that?
Yeah. That's an excellent question, and Tanya probably knows a bit more about that than I do. But my sense is that the first women who are hired are ones who've done things like go to these cooking schools, who've tried to take a look at the whole question of homemaking, not just from the individual woman's point of view, but sort of from a broader social point of view. But then pretty soon, within really just about 10 or 20 years, Iowa State can start hiring its own graduates. And that's what we do for the second generation. Once we start training master's students, once we start training doctoral students, then they become the nucleus for what becomes really a very accomplished group of women faculty here. Tanya, I don't know if you want to add anything?
Okay. We want to thank Amy for coming and sharing this information, and I'm sure she'll stick around and answer a question or two if anybody else is shy and wants to ask it in private. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.